So we're going to be first masking the areas that have got to stay white, and we're going to use masking fluid for that. This is Winsor & Newton. Shake it well because the bottom, the rubber tends to settle out, and then you'll have a very thin solution if you don't shake it, and that will tend to bite into the paper. So using a very thin stylus pen, I first of all did the whiskers, these very fine lines, because you can't paint around them. So we're going to do his whiskers and his beard, parts of the nose, and of course the eyes, because we want those to stay white. So after the pen, I used a fine brush to white out parts of the nose. You have to keep looking at the picture to see which areas you want to stay light. And when this is all dry, we can begin with our painting. You can use a brush or the fine pen. If you're using a brush, soak it in soap first of all, because the rubber solution will ruin the brush. Don't use an expensive brush. This is a small flat brush and I'm using it fairly dry, and then I get a nice hair form underneath his beard. So I'm just filling in that now. Test your paper first. Perhaps if this is 300 gram NOT cold press paper, they have different surfaces. Sometimes this fluid can take off the surface of the paper when you take it off if the paper's too soft. So it might be good to test your paper first. Just paint an area and let it dry and then take it off. Don't leave this stuff on for longer than 24 hours, because then you're going to have problems getting it off. So have to take a little bit more time, obviously, doing things like the eyes. They have to be very accurate. Compare to the photo again. Make sure you've got all the light areas that are going to stay white. Later on we'll colour them in a bit, but some areas will stay pretty much white. I'm using a rigger brush here, where there are different names for these brushes. Got a nice long point to it, and you can use it for large areas or very fine lines. So I'm using standard colours really. Sepia, up the top there is Indian yellow. I prefer that to cadmium yellow. It mixes nicely, doesn't turn dirty when you mix it with darker colours. Yeah, there's sepia I shall be using there, and burnt umber. A little bit of turquoise I will use was on the right there inside his legs, but you'll see that in a moment. So first of all, let's get some water on the paper. We don't need to be too careful here, but and we don't want it too wet, but we do want it wet enough so that when we put our watercolor on, it will start to blend. So yeah, just go over it once and it will stay damp for a while, depending on room temperature of course. But once you've got the main area wetted out, it doesn't matter if you go over the edge, because we'll be blacking the edges later on. So just make sure you've got it nice and wet, because the paper will absorb quite a bit of the water and it will stay damp for quite a time. We don't want any pools of water on the painting, but we do want it wet enough. So nice clean water here with this nice large brush. So then we're going to start with the lighter colours first. So this is a sort of mix of Indian yellow and there's a tiny bit of sienna in there. Basically, you don't want to go over it over and over again. We want to get a thin wash of this light yellow colour because it gives a brilliance to the picture afterwards. The animal hasn't really got any yellow in it, but we're going to paint over a lot of this yellow, and this very light background of yellow will give a brilliance to the other colours we're going to use. Yeah? So try not to get the colour too even. Put it on with this nice wide brush. The paper is still wet, and some places you leave it darker, some you leave it stronger. Don't mess around with it. Get it on and just leave it. Now putting in some sienna. The thing about, I think, everyone who does watercolour at the beginning stays too long because it looks dreadful and you think, I can't leave like this. But that is, the paper is working for us at the moment, so I don't have to be too careful around the eyes because I've screened them off with the rubber solution. I want some colours down here. Now, if we have got too much colour on, which you'll see in a moment we have, you can always take colour off, especially when it's nice and damp still. But you can even take it off once it's dry. But first of all, I'm putting in quite a strong mix of sienna. There's a little bit of cadmium orange in there, but I didn't want to use too much orange because the Indian yellow will give me those tones. So this painting looks, yeah, you might think fairly dreadful at the moment, but there's some more water going in, I noticed, because it's drying out a little bit. So I want this area wet now because we're going to be going in with some darker colours. But use the colour very strong and let the paper spread it for you, the pigment. Yeah? At the moment it looks fairly dreadful, but you'll see in a moment as it begins to, once it's dried, the pigment will start to diffuse on the paper. So underneath here he's very dark. So we've got to be a little bit careful where we paint here. We don't want to go over the light parts, but we've got a nice burnt umber mixed with Payne's grey there. There's a little bit of indigo blue, dark blue in, but you can use other blues, whatever your taste is. And already you can see perhaps the colour is separating a little bit. So underneath his chin is the darkest area, so I'm going to put that in. Got to be a little bit careful above where I'm going now because I haven't screened the nose off completely. This will be his mouth, so be a little bit careful there. That's where this brush is good because it's got a nice point to it as well as being very wide if you need it. So on one side a little bit more colour. Now some leave the board or their paper at 10 degrees about by propping it up one end so that the colours run into each other. You can do that, but at the moment I've just lifted the board up and letting the colours run into each other a bit. So this is useful. I've put it back because I don't want to run in too far. And I've noticed there's too much colour on here, so I'm using a paper towel. Always reference your picture. Make sure you get it just how you want it. So I'm taking off this watercolour is very wet. So I've got the form now of the shadow under his chin. It's quite a V form. So I took off too much colour there. I've just put a little bit of colour back, but I've got the form right. So the darkness, yeah, around the eye. I'm trying to get a bit of a 3D effect here, so I've put some darker colour under the eyes, and when this is dry, this will settle out as well and give a nice 3D effect. So it's still looking a bit rough at the moment, but it will change. And this is where you've got to avoid the temptation to overwork it. Get the colour on and let the paper do the rest. Yeah, so this area here is going to be darker. He's in shadow, and I'm just going over it again to darken it up a little bit. Yeah, under there it needs to be very strong, and later on I should darken down between his pores as well. So I'm lightening up here because on the picture you'll notice it's got a very light turquoise colour. I didn't put that on the colour list, I just had some on the palette. Very light turquoise because it's got this beautiful, he's actually white, his fur I should think, but in shade it's got a very nice light blue touch to it. So I shall fill that in with some very thin turquoise wash. But first of all I want to get the colour off so that I've got white paper again near enough. Down the bottom you see I've put some turquoise in and darkened the middle between his pores. Now I'm taking colour off now, because if you look at the picture he's got these wonderful light areas, and I've done this with a bristle brush, and these areas here have got to stay fairly light and they'll give us some shadow. So I'm taking colour off now. Here I've got too much colour, too dark, so I'm taking off some there. I've darkened the back of his leg at the back there because that's in shadow. So now I've taken off both sides and it's completely dry now. This is important because we're going to take the rubber solution off. You can use a rubber or your finger. It has to be completely dry. So you can either do that with a hair dryer or just leave it half an hour or so, but make sure it's completely dry before you take the masking fluid off. So that's what I'm doing here. So you can see he's starting to look more like a big cat. So this is around the eyes. I'm taking the whole thing off. Under there we can see the whiskers nicely now, his small beard. So if you run over it with your hand afterwards, you'll feel if there's anything still on there, because it feels rubbery. Yeah? So go over the whole thing, make sure you've got all of the masking fluid off, and then we can start putting in some details. So the next bit is a bit painstaking. This is going to take some time. I'm going to black the eyes in first of all. Make sure you look at your photo and get a good copy of what's going on the photo. So underneath his eyes, he's obviously got this very dark shadow. Got a very small brush here, it's a number 2 I think, and a very strong mix of indigo and Payne's grey or neutral tint you can use, and burnt umber. So it's got to be dark and strong, and you need a lot of it. So make sure in your mixing palette, because we're going to do the spots soon, and I'll use the bigger brush again. So once we've got the fine details in, we can start working on the background. Now in this Davinci eye, I put practically every point, every spot he's got, I put in detail. I would advise that, because you might think, oh, I'll just put spots anywhere, but it doesn't work. Nature does it the best. So through the watercolor I can see the lines I've drawn. I can still see the outline of the whole thing, but in his on his skin he's got these dozens and dozens of little spots, and I'm going to take the time using not this small brush. I shall use the rigger brush, but I shall take my time and try and copy almost all of them exactly the way they are. Here I'm using the other end of the brush, which I've sharpened with a knife to give me a wooden point. Very good for making fine lines. You put the watercolor on fairly thick, fairly wet, and then you can draw it out using the end of the brush. This takes a little bit of time, this bit, because the eyes are very important, so we need them fairly accurate. So take your time, make sure that they're nice and round, and then they'll be lifelike. In the middle of the eye he's got two very small white spots of reflection. I've masked those off, and I didn't rub those away. I should take them away at the end once everything's dry. Now I'm starting to put his markings on. Now this is going to took me about half an hour, I think, yeah. But there we've got most of them in. Got these wonderful forms here. And now you see why we lightened up, because you can't do that afterwards. You can't take any colour off now, as you're going to smudge the markings. I only put a loose outline around the back because that's all going to be darkened in. I just did it for reference. So here you can see that you can still see the pencil marks where I've drawn in. I've tried to keep them as accurate as possible. Now the nose there, where I've taken the masking fluid off, is going to be worked later on. You can see here these lighter areas I'm showing was where I took the colour off with the bristle brush, and that's given us a lovely shadow in his paws and legs. So you can see that the whiskers stand out nicely and the beard at the bottom, but this has got to be blended now. So his nose is going to be dark, but the top there above the nose is a little bit of white, and I've left that so. So now I'm going to take the same colour, the mix we were using with Indian yellow sienna. I'm going to wet it with a very, very thin solution of this colour, try and loosen those marks. A bit too much there. Don't want those hard lines in. And then I should just dab some of that colour in to the wet area to let it blend again. Here it is, and you can't see the connection between what was there before and what's afterwards. So that will dry on its own. Now I'm going back into the dark colour with the small brush again, and again here we have to be very careful. It's got this lovely detail. Get these parts of the nose just right, and there are some areas in there that are still white in the picture. I shall leave that. This line is very faint, so we keep that as small as possible. Using a very fine brush there, and then I'm going to concentrate on the nose. You can see the pencil lines are still very clear. If you want, when the painting's finished, you can always rub pencil lines out through the watercolour but I leave them in mostly. You just can't see them really. So now it's time to fill in the details of the nose. He's got a very, very sharp point at the end of his nostrils. I was having trouble here with this brush. It's got a bit of a dodgy end on it. It's getting old, I suppose. So you need a very fine point to do this, so make sure you've got a good pointed brush, small one. Same on the other side. That's more like it. And the middle area is you'll see in the picture, sort of light grey. And all animal noses have got this marvellous sort of 3D wetness about them, so we want to shadow that afterwards, which is what I'm doing here under his beard. He's got these dark areas here. I've wet the paper a little bit first, and I've just dotted some of the dark mix, and that will spread a little bit into the white of the beard. Beard's not completely white, so we'll tone that down just a little bit. Got some of this very light this very thin lines. I'm using the end of the brush, the wooden end, and some of this dark mix into the wet. I've wetted the beard a little bit, and then I just draw some of the dark colour in. So we can concentrate then on the middle part of the nose. You see above the nose now, that's run slightly upwards, which is good. Still very light above the nose, but it's blended apart a little bit. Yeah, here he's got a very light shadow. I've got some of that turquoise colour on again. It's almost transparent, but it's important because it shadows the eyes. So you've got to look at the original in detail and get it as accurate as you can. And now he's leaning on a branch, so I've got a wettish mix here of, I've wet the whole thing first of all with water, and I'm putting some of the same colours we've used. There's a bit of Indian yellow, we're going to have some burnt umber in there. It's still very wet, look, and I'm just drawing the colours out a little bit. Don't overwork it, it's going to be a wooden log. At the moment it doesn't look that good, but you'll see at the end. Yeah, don't over blend it, just pull it across a bit, dab colour in. That's a general rule with watercolour. Don't go over it too often, just pull the colour about a bit. I'm going to let that first of all dry. I'm going to do the other side as well in a similar way. First a nice wash, nice and wet, then some very thin Indian yellow with a bit of sienna mixed. Try always to mix colours before you put them on the paper. Most colours, always tone them down or up a little bit with another colour. And you can leave some of the paper practically white, that's always good for shadow and stuff. I'll put some of that burnt umber in. side a bit. Let's dry it off a little bit. So when this is dry, I've put some green in there as well that I had on my palette over there. Didn't mix up anything else. Quite often I leave the palette with some colours in from the day before, whatever. Put some green in there. When this is dry, I'm going to use this wax candle and skim over the top of the paper. Now this is a medium rough paper. That means the wax is going to sit on parts of the paper, and you'll see in a minute what effect that has when you go over it again. It's time to start filling in the back. The bottom is drying. Using this wide brush, I've got to get a fairly accurate outline now. So the first bit I have to be a little bit careful, but then start using big strokes. Don't go over it and over it and over it. Lots of water, lots of colour. You'll have light areas then and dark areas. I didn't want it totally black like it is in the picture because that's uninteresting. Here you see the water is breaking up. I don't know if there's my finger fat or something is on the paper. It doesn't matter. It's quite interesting. Sometimes it does that. Haven't got to be too accurate here, but a little bit. There's the line you can still see. So pull some of the colour across. I've mixed up a lot of this dark colour because you're going to use a lot, so if you run out in the middle, that's not good. Make sure you've got a nice tray full before you start. So I'm using lots of water and just letting the paper do the rest. Now of course, having this dark background makes the leopard or cheetah or whatever he is, makes him stand out even more, which is good. If I'd left it white, it would also have been nice. I only thought of that after I saw it finished, that it was actually good when it was white as well, but anyway, both look good. So I'm using the fine point to get the outline in, and then just the same as on the other side. I'm running out of paint there. I'm going to have to mix up some more. Didn't want a white edge, so I've covered that off. Some completely white areas there, some grey. Makes it more interesting. Just dab in some more colour in there next to these areas that are drying out already. Makes it interesting. Once it's dry, you can see down the bottom there the colour is separating. You can see the blues coming through into the beauty of watercolour and the paper working together. So I've had to mix up a bit more. Payne's grey or neutral tint is a great colour because it's not like black. It doesn't dirty the colours you're using, it just tones them down. I'm taking a little bit of time to do the outline. See the pencil mark still there. Again on the other side. So that was finished. The branch was dry now. So I'm going to put a coat of wax. I have to press fairly hard using the flat side of the wax candle, and this will be a nice grainy effect then for the wood of the branch. I'm going to use the same colours again. There's that green with a bit of burnt umber mixed in. I'm going to give that again, not trying to cover the whole thing, just get the colour on and let the paper do the rest. Darker at the bottom, so I've mixed some more burnt umber in. It's starting to leach out a bit because it's very wet. I've wet the paper a little bit again over the wax, but not too much, because the watercolour, the mix is quite wet. So I should just put a bit of shadow in under his paw and do the same over the other side. Burnt umber with this green makes a nice, very natural sort of colour. You can see the wax resist is doing its job. Some people don't like it because once you've done it you can't change it, you can't get the wax off, but that's why you've got to know what you want to do. But I find it gives a very natural effect, things like branches, stonework, buildings. Use plenty of water with it once you've got the colour on. I'm just doing the part between his legs there. So we're there nearly, once it's dry. All watercolours need a nice frame with a passe-partout. Let's set them off afterwards. So that was it. I hope you enjoyed it. These colours here, nice and dark underneath, look very, very natural. Again, very important with this picture, the original drawing, as accurate as possible. I use Davinci. It's a drawing app, you can do it freehand, but when you've got a good outline you're going to get good results. So I hope you enjoyed the painting. See you next time.